Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're diving into a topic that's it's deeply personal and also incredibly relevant to like the social fabric of America. We're talking about the white working class experience.
Yeah, in Appalachia.
Yeah.
It's a region that I think is often misunderstood. And to be honest, misrepresented in like mainstream media. So we're going to try to like go beyond those stereotypes
Yeah.
today to uncover like the real cultural and socioeconomic forces
Mm.
that are shaping the lives of people who identify as hillbillies.
And to guide us on this journey, we have J.D. Vance's memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which I think it's safe to say has sparked a lot of debate. We're also going to be pulling in some perspectives from Goodreads reviews, get a sense of how the book has landed with different readers.
Yeah, it's a good point to bring up that Vance himself is a really fascinating figure. From his upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, to serving in the Marines, to graduating from Yale Law School, and now, as of this year, being the Republican vice presidential candidate. His background definitely informs his perspective.
Absolutely. It's like he's almost straddling two worlds. But, before we get too deep into Vance's personal journey, I think it's worth taking a step back and exploring the broader context. Like, what is it about the hillbilly identity that feels so distinct? Where does that even come from?
Well, Vance paints a pretty vivid picture of this culture in his book. He describes, a fierce sense of loyalty to family and community, this deep distrust of outsiders and institutions, and a tendency toward self-reliance, but also sometimes violence.
Right. And he illustrates this with that anecdote about his mama, his grandmother, throwing a glass ashtray at his papa during an argument.
Yeah. On the surface, that just seems like a crazy family story, right?
Hey.
But think about what it reveals about the cultural dynamics at play here.
Yeah.
It speaks to a certain level of volatility, that rawness of emotion that you don't often see in more like buttoned-up communities.
Yeah.
It might even suggest that conflict in some ways is part of their way of like relating to one another.
That's a really insightful point. It's not just about the act itself, but what it symbolizes about how they interact, how they express love even.
Exactly. And you can connect it back to the history of the region. Think about the Scots-Irish immigrants who settled in Appalachia. They faced incredibly harsh conditions, isolation, poverty. They had to be tough and resourceful and fiercely protective of their own. So it makes sense that those traits would become ingrained in the culture.
It's almost like a survival mechanism. Those characteristics that help them endure hardship are the same ones that can sometimes lead to conflict and isolation in the modern world.
Precisely. And speaking of the modern world, we can't ignore the economic realities that have shaped Appalachia. The decline of manufacturing jobs in the Rust Belt has had a devastating impact on the region.
Yeah, Vance talks about this a lot. He describes it as like a loss of identity, a loss of purpose for a whole generation of men who define themselves by their ability to work, to provide for their families.
And this isn't just about a lack of income, right? It's about the erosion of a way of life, a sense of belonging and community that was built around those factories and mines. When those jobs disappeared, so did a lot of the social fabric that held those communities together.
And I think that's where the learned helplessness that Vance talks about comes into play.
Right. Learned helplessness is essentially this belief that your actions don't have any power to change your circumstances. It's a sense of resignation that sets in when you feel like you've been dealt a bad hand and there's nothing you can do about it.
He talks about seeing this firsthand in his own family. His mom struggled with addiction. And he describes this cycle of self-sabotage that felt almost inevitable. Like she truly believed she wasn't worthy of anything better.
And that's where things get really complex. Because while individual choices certainly play a role, we have to acknowledge the larger forces at play. The lack of opportunities, the limited access to education and healthcare, the stigma surrounding mental health and addiction. All of these contribute to that sense of being trapped.
And when you combine that feeling of being trapped with the cultural traits we were discussing earlier, the distrust of outsiders, the tendency to turn inward, it creates a potent mix that's hard to break out of.
Absolutely. And I think that's why Hillbilly Elegy, despite its flaws, has resonated with so many people. It offers a glimpse into a world that's often misunderstood, a world where the American dream can sometimes feel more like a cruel illusion.
Yeah, and the Goodreads reviews we've pulled definitely reflect that range of reactions. Some praising Vance for his honesty and insight, while others criticize him for perpetuating stereotypes or offering overly simplistic solutions.
It's a complex issue.
Fair.
And I think that's what makes it so worth exploring. It challenges us to look beyond our own assumptions and to grapple with the difficult realities facing a significant portion of our population.
And as we continue this deep dive, I'm curious to see how Vance's own journey, from struggling kid in Middletown to Yale law grad to politician. Fits into this larger narrative.
Yeah, I think that's a key question to keep in mind. Does his personal success validate his perspective? Or does it create a blind spot? When it comes to understanding the struggles of those who haven't been able to escape, the cycle of poverty.
We'll definitely be unpacking that in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it really is an interesting paradox, isn't it? That Vance's own success could be seen as a testament to the possibility of upward mobility, but it could also be seen as like a potential barrier to really understanding the challenges faced by, those who haven't had the same opportunities.
Yeah, and that's precisely what makes his story so compelling and why it sparks such intense debate. Some people see him as a shining example of the American dream, while others view him with suspicion, questioning whether he's truly representative of the hillbilly experience.
And I think those contrasting views speak to a larger tension within American society. This tension between individual agency and the systemic forces that shape our lives.
One of the Goodreads reviewers actually pointed out that Vance doesn't really offer any concrete solutions to the problems he describes in the book. They felt like he focused too much on individual responsibility and not enough on the structural inequalities that contribute to poverty and lack of opportunity.
Yeah, that's a valid criticism. And it reflects a larger debate about how to address these complex social issues. Is it about encouraging individuals to work harder to make better choices? Or is it about dismantling the systems that perpetuate poverty and inequality?
It's almost like a chicken and egg problem, right? How can you expect individuals to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when the very ground they're standing on is unstable?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to consider the concept of social capital. It's a term that sociologists use to describe the networks of relationships and connections that can help people access opportunities and support.
Yeah, Vance actually touches on this in the book. He talks about how his mama, despite her flaws and her volatile nature, was incredibly resourceful. She knew how to navigate systems, how to get things done, and she wasn't afraid to ask for help when she needed it.
That speaks to the power of community and how those informal networks of support can be essential for survival, especially in marginalized communities.
But it also raises the question, what happens when those networks break down? What happens when people are isolated, either geographically or socially? How do they build social capital when they lack the connections and resources to do so?
And that's where we have to think about creating more equitable systems that provide access to quality education, affordable housing and healthcare, systems that foster a sense of community and belonging, regardless of background or circumstance.
But creating those systems requires a shift in mindset, right? We have to move beyond this individualistic mentality and recognize the interconnectedness of our lives. We have to acknowledge that our personal success is often built on the backs of those who came before us, and that our failures can have ripple effects throughout our communities.
I think that's one of the most challenging aspects of this conversation. It forces us to confront our own privileges and biases. It asks us to consider how our own actions, even seemingly small ones, might contribute to the systems of inequality that we're trying to dismantle.
It can be easy to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem. Where do you even begin to address something as deeply rooted as poverty and inequality?
Well, I think it starts with listening, with being willing to hear the stories of those who have lived these experiences, to understand their perspectives, and to acknowledge the systemic forces that have shaped their lives.
And it's not just about hearing those stories, it's about amplifying them, about using our own platforms and privileges to advocate for change.
Absolutely. And it's about being willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases, to recognize that even within our own families and communities, there are diverse experiences and perspectives.
One thing that really struck me in the book was Vance's description of the alienation that many working-class Americans feel, particularly those in the Rust Belt. They feel forgotten, ignored by the political and economic elite.
And that feeling of alienation can be so powerful. It can lead to resentment, to anger, to a sense of hopelessness that can be really hard to shake.
Then Vance argues that this alienation contributed to the rise of figures like Donald Trump, who promised to, drain the swamp and give voice to the forgotten.
And whether you agree with his politics or not, there's no denying that he tapped into a deep well of frustration and disillusionment. He gave people a sense of belonging, a sense that someone was finally listening to their concerns.
But the question is, how do we address that underlying sense of alienation in a way that's constructive, that doesn't just exploit people's anger and fear?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It requires us to create spaces for dialogue, to build bridges across ideological divides, and to find common ground on the issues that affect us all.
And it requires us to recognize the humanity in everyone, regardless of their background or beliefs. To approach these conversations with empathy and a willingness to understand, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's about remembering that behind every statistic, every political debate, every stereotype, there are real people with real lives, real struggles, and real hopes for the future.
As we've been going through Hillbilly Elegy and really getting into the heart of these complex issues, one question that just keeps coming back to me is upward mobility. That American dream we hear so much about. Is it truly attainable for everyone, or does it come down to luck, circumstance, or
Yeah.
maybe even just escaping your roots?
It's the age-old debate, isn't it? Nature versus nurture, personal responsibility versus systemic barriers, and Vance's own story. While inspiring in a lot of ways, doesn't really offer a clear-cut answer.
He managed to break free from, you know, a cycle of poverty and addiction that seemed to trap so many people around him. He joined the Marines, got a Yale law degree. Now he's a senator and a vice presidential candidate. But it wasn't, a smooth or easy path at all. And he's really open about that in the book. He talks about the guilt he felt, the feeling of being caught between two worlds. He succeeded in a way that many of his family and friends never could. And that creates a sense of distance, of not quite belonging anywhere.
Right. And some of the Goodreads reviewers we saw really picked up on that tension. They questioned whether Vance, having achieved such a high level of success, could truly understand the struggles of those who are still trapped in that cycle.
Yeah, it's a fair point. But I think what Vance's story does illustrate is the power of individual agency, even within a system that can often feel stacked against you. But doesn't that run the risk of placing too much emphasis on personal responsibility? We're almost blaming people for circumstances that are largely beyond their control.
Yeah. It's definitely a delicate balance. We can't ignore those systemic factors at play. The lack of access to quality education, the scarcity of well-paying jobs, the generational trauma that's passed down through families.
So then how do we reconcile those two perspectives? How do we acknowledge the systemic barriers while also empowering individuals to create change in their own lives?
I think it starts with recognizing the interconnectedness of these issues. It's not an either proposition. It's about understanding that individual choices are made within a larger social context, and that changing that context requires collective action.
And that's where things like social capital come in. It's not just about, individual grit and determination. It's about having access to networks of support, mentors, opportunities that can open doors and provide guidance.
Right. And Vance himself benefited from that kind of support, even if it wasn't always obvious. He had teachers who believed in him, Marines who instilled discipline and structure, and a Yale law professor who became like a mentor to him.
And I think that's a really important takeaway for our listeners. We all have a role to play in creating those networks of support. It could be as simple as mentoring a young person, volunteering in your community, or speaking up against injustice when you see it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our individual actions, no matter how small they might seem, can have a ripple effect and contribute to creating a more just and equitable society.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hillbilly Elegy and the complexities of the white working class experience in Appalachia, I think the most important thing is to approach these conversations with empathy and an open mind.
Yeah. We need to be willing to listen to different perspectives, to challenge our own assumptions, and to work together to find solutions that benefit everyone, not just those who've already won the lottery of birth and circumstance.
Because ultimately, creating a society where upward mobility is truly possible for everyone, that's the real American dream, isn't it?
It really is, and it's a dream worth fighting for.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope it's given you some new insights and maybe even inspired you to get involved in creating a more equitable future.